Welcome to another episode of the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today we're joined by one of the foremost historians on the Eastern Front, Dr. Prit Buttar. His new book, Into the Reich, The Red Army's Advance to the Oder in 1945, is a gripping and deeply researched account of the final months of the Third Reich. A moment when the Red Army surged across Poland, liberated Auschwitz, confronted the collapsing Wehrmacht. A moment when the Red Army surged across Poland and liberated Auschwitz and advanced toward the Oder in a campaign that would shape not just the end of the war, but the geopolitical map of post-war Europe. Enriched with powerful first-hand accounts, this book explores Stalin's political ambitions, the brutal realities of total war, and the desperate German counterattacks that briefly slowed the Soviet advance. Dr. Buttar, a former British Army physician and acclaimed author of To Besiege a City and Hero City, joins us from Scotland to discuss the strategic goals, political tensions, and human stories behind this pivotal 1945 offensive. Dr. Buttar, welcome back to the Speaking of Writers podcast.
Thank you very much for having me back. It's a great pleasure.
So what first drew you to this particular phase of the Eastern Front, the drive from the Vistula to the Oder in early 1945?
In many respects, this is part of a chronology that I have been working through, and inevitably I was going to reach this point. You can think of this as the midpoint of a trilogy that started with Bagration. It now carries the Red Army from the Vistula to the Oder, and then the Battle of Berlin still lies ahead. So I think it's very much a sort of integral part of a much bigger story. I guess one of the important things about it is that the story of the Soviet Union through the Second World War is a nation that, like pretty much every nation in the war, including Germany, entered it with a lot of ideas about how a future war would be fought that were simply not valid. The Red Army had to learn the realities of war in the most punishing circumstances possible, whilst literally fighting for the survival of its nation. And I think this operation sees the Red Army functioning at about the peak of its capabilities. This is an operation where actually they get pretty much everything right that they needed to get right. There aren't any catastrophic mistakes. There aren't any bludgeoning, pointless mass assaults. It is, if you like, the moment when the Red Army's cudgel actually works as it's meant to, without just relying on sheer brute force. It's a pinnacle, if you like, because what lies ahead, the brutal drive from the Oder to Berlin and into Berlin, is almost a reversion to type of, well, if in doubt, you just throw more men at the problem until basically the other side runs out of ammunition and then you can move on. So, yeah, it's the pinnacle of the evolution of the Red Army, if you like.
Your medical background and years in the British Army are well known. How do those experiences inform the way you interpret battlefield accounts and human testimony?
That's a very good question and an interesting question. I think the starting point of any interpretation of first-hand accounts is getting a feeling for what is true and what isn't. And it's not necessarily what is entirely fictional, but understanding that sometimes people's accounts are more, if you like, of an impressionist view of what was happening rather than a strictly, line by line, painstakingly accurate account. Quite often, particularly for Soviet veterans who were not encouraged to write about their personal experiences straight after the war unless it, absolutely conformed with Soviet doctrine and Soviet historiography. Many of these people then wrote their accounts, in the 80s, the 90s, by which time you're asking them to dredge up memories from nearly half a century before. And of course, they're going to get events in the wrong order. They're going to conflate different events and say it all happened at the same time. That doesn't necessarily deny that some of those things or most of those things happened. They may just have got the order wrong. So I think And again, when I've been talking to patients and trying to dissect their version of accounts from what I know is a more likely version of accounts, you just have to accept that people's subjective memory, for all sorts of very, very good reasons, even before we get into the possibility of people deliberately wanting to mislead you, people's recollection is often flawed. And sometimes it's more important almost to listen to the emotions and the feelings behind what is being said than necessarily the strict detail of what is being said.
January 1945 is often framed as the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. What major misconceptions do people still have about this phase of the war?
Again, it's a really interesting question. I think the English language account of this phase of the conflict very much concentrates on the Battle of the Bulge, the approach to the Rhine, the forcing of the Rhine, and then the drive across Western Germany, the Americans moving into Bavaria, liberating Dachau and other concentration camps, the British and Canadians in the north reaching Belsen and places like that. And if there is any mention of what is happening further east, it's largely in the context of, well, the Red Army was going to get to Berlin first, and there wasn't much point in Western blood being spilled for ground that we were going to give back to the Soviets anyway. There is no real regard for the fact that even at this late stage of the war, the great bulk of the German war effort was still concentrated on fighting in the East, even though Hitler had prioritized defeating the Western Allies whilst leaving what he described as the bare minimum in the East. That bare minimum still accounted for in excess of 60 or 70% of the German war effort. The conflict in the East, I think, in the English speaking world has often been overlooked because of linguistic problems and naturally because it wasn't people's grandparents who were fighting in that in those battles. But I think all of the very, very hard fighting in the Ardennes region, in the Rhineland afterwards, it would have been infinitely harder if the Red Army hadn't been absorbing just so much of Germany's war effort.
How did you navigate the challenge of presenting both Soviet and German perspectives here, especially given the political sensitivities surrounding the final months of the Eastern Front?
Again, this is a real challenge because the Soviet accounts are unreliable because many of the officers who wrote those accounts about their time as army commanders, division commanders, whatever, they were writing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where everything had to conform to Soviet historiography and were often censored or they were told to rewrite chunks of it or whatever. As a result, during that period in the West, these Soviet accounts were regarded with at least a degree of skepticism. Oddly enough, the same skepticism was not extended to German accounts, which in their own way are just as unreliable. You know, the Eastern Front is an unusual conflict from the English language point of view because it's one of the few um, it's one of the few wars where the history has been written for the English-speaking world largely by the losers rather than the victors. The German accounts that emerged in the 50s and 60s when there was enormous requirement to rehabilitate West Germany so that it could play its part in NATO. The German accounts were largely accepted without criticism, without question. And it's only more recently that people have looked at those and thought, okay, so let's actually look closely at it. So, for example, when you look at the accounts of the number of Soviet tanks destroyed in individual battles, the accounts of individual tank crews fighting extraordinary actions. I don't doubt that they did fight many extraordinary actions. I also don't doubt that an awful lot of these were massively exaggerated. So correlating the two can often be difficult because you are sometimes left with the feeling that these people are describing completely different battles, that there's almost no common ground between them. And yet that is exactly what they're doing. They are describing exactly the same conflicts. In a way, you almost have to pick through all of the wreckage and see which accounts would be unreliable in a given battle and why that unreliability would creep in. And once you've sort of bracketed those and thought, okay, I'll treat those bits with a bit of skepticism. What is left? What does that tell me? And then comparing that with a similar exercise on the other side to try to get towards something approaching the truth. But yeah, it is a real challenge. And I imagine that in another 10, 15 years, somebody will go through many of my accounts and say, well, this is flawed. This isn't quite right. This is unbalanced or whatever. That's just the nature of the subject.
One of the most powerful elements of this campaign was the Red Army's liberation of Auschwitz. How did the soldiers and officers react to what they found there?
I think this is an occasion where the Soviet accounts are actually quite reliable because there was no reason to lie about it. Um, Many of the soldiers were absolutely devastated by what they experienced, and they were haunted for the rest of their lives, exactly as you would expect. There was one account that I had read, but I could not find when I was writing this, where I think he was a company commander with one of the units that entered Auschwitz, and towards the end of the day, he went in search of his battalion commander and just said to him, Comrade Major, I need to get my men out of here. We cannot stay here. He could just see the effect it was having on his soldiers. Others spoke about, their own role in taking revenge on any of the SS guards who fell into their hands. And again, I'm sure, well, we know that that happened. I imagine there were some who, after the war, wished they had taken part in such reprisals and may well have written about their own role in imagined reprisals. Very, very hard to say now, isn't it? But there were some accounts which I thought were just so powerful. There was one in particular that really moved me. The account of the airman who was ordered to carry out bombing raids on a railway yard not far from Auschwitz, and he said that we were told to drop bombs from a much higher altitude than normal because the purpose wasn't actually to destroy anything. It was just to terrify the Germans into running. And he said we bombed the railway yards from several thousand meters up. When when we moved on, we discovered that those trains had been about to move concentration camp prisoners, but our air raid had led to many of the Germans fleeing. And he finished his little anecdote by saying, if that is genuinely the case, then that is probably the one mission that I can be most proud of in my service. And I found that a very, very powerful
Yeah.
account of just someone reflecting on something he did that he didn't even know was part of the Auschwitz story, and yet may have had a profound effect.
Yeah. Do you think Western leaders fully understood Stalin's intentions for Eastern Europe at this time?
Gosh, I have to say, Steve, you've got some fantastic questions here.
Thank you.
This is really challenging stuff. So let me start with a little anecdote. I remember uh, just as I was retiring as a physician, I mentored a younger doc who was returning to work after a break for maternity. So I would meet up with her once a week, and we would talk about her experiences, what she was finding difficult, what was causing her problems, etc. And we would just talk this through. And at one point, she was talking about some of her experiences, and she was saying, "I wish I had known 5 years ago some of the things I know now about working with people, working with colleagues, etc." And I just said to her, I think you probably knew that at the time, but emotionally perhaps you hadn't quite accepted some of those truths. So when we read about the experience of Roosevelt in particular at Yalta, and to an extent Churchill certainly had his suspicions about the Soviet intentions. Roosevelt, I think, chose not to have or chose not to place credence on those suspicions because he was so determined to realize his vision of the post-world order centered around his creation of the United Nations that he was prepared to overlook evidence that was very, very stark and very strong, and instead to believe, if you like, what he would like the Soviet intentions to have been. And I think there was a degree of acquiescence on the part of the United States at Yalta, which even, looking at Soviet accounts, it's quite clear that the Soviets were amazed at how pliant the Western powers were and how Churchill was very much sidelined, and it was, and to be, let's be straight here. Churchill made it very easy for the others to sideline him because he was drunk so much of the time, and it was very easy to discount him and just say he's just a burned out fossil from a previous era. We're talking about a new world order, and if it means we have to give Comrade Stalin a little bit of leeway, look what we're going to get in return. I don't know whether if Roosevelt had survived, if he had then looked back on that, would he have had regrets, or would he have said, well, in order to get what we got, that was the price that had to be paid. Perhaps that is the cold-blooded realpolitik. So, in answer to your question, I think they probably either knew or strongly suspected, but they regarded this as a price that was worth paying. And again, to be very, very cynical, they were very happy for East Europeans to pay the price for what they wanted.
You've written multiple acclaimed works on the Eastern Front, including your Leningrad series. Where does Into the Reich fit in your broader exploration of 20th century conflict?
I think this and the book that follows it about Berlin are very much on the cusp of the end of one conflict and the beginning of the next. And others have said this too, that, these are, if you like, the first moments of the Cold War that is going, that, it certainly shaped the world that I grew up in as a child and that I served in as a young army officer. And I think these are battles, these are campaigns, political discussions and decisions that not only influenced how one conflict was finally brought to a very, very bloody end, but also very much laid the foundations for what was to follow. So yeah, it's if you like, the overlap between two different worlds, which then echo onwards all the way through to the early 1990s.
So Berlin is next for you, the next book. I last time I had you on, Prit, you had mentioned I think that you were working on a book with your daughter too.
Yes. Yeah, oh yes, there's loads to come. So Berlin is now in production with Osprey and should be published, I think, relatively early next year. Um, my daughter and I have finished the manuscript of Warsaw, a city at war, covering the history of the city from 1939 to 45. Inevitably, it involves a bit of a dive into Polish history from the end of the First World War through to the beginning of the Second World War, just to understand the politics within the country. Um, we've finished that manuscript and we're now waiting for Osprey to come back with a list of questions and corrections and clarifications and rewrites, etc. And we are currently researching and beginning to write another book which covers Paris through the war. And again, that at the moment we're indulging ourselves by absolutely plunging headlong down of some very deep rabbit holes about French politics, ranging all the way back into the 19th century and how that shaped French political thought and prejudices, etc. It's always an interesting experience to see how much of that survives the editing process in the end, by the time the final manuscript comes. Beyond that, we've been discussing other cities we may look at. Hamburg has come up as a possible, but we shall see. We shall see.
All right, well, we'll have you back on for the Berlin book, and then hopefully you and your daughter together on the next one, the Warsaw book.
Well, well, what can I say? If you have her alongside me, I'll just leave her to it because she is far more articulate than I am and infinitely better looking. So we'll definitely let her um, have the rule of that one. Yeah.
Right. Well, Into the Reich, the Red Army's advance to the Oder in 1945. That is available now, a definitive human-centered account of the Soviet drive into the heart of the Third Reich and the political forces that shaped post-war Europe. You can learn more about Prit Buttar and his work through Osprey Publishing or wherever books are sold. Prit Buttar, thank you so much for joining me again here on the Speaking of Writers podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
And thank you for watching. Like it, share it, subscribe to it, write a review too if you'd like. I'm Steve Richards. I'll talk to you again next time.